Hello, welcome to the newest installment of TCU Presents. Today we will be looking back at the Vietnam War. Before we begin, I'd like to ask that you do a couple of things. One, could you put in the Q&A function the year that you graduated from TCU? We wanted to have a little bit of a sense of who our audience is as we go forward. The second thing, the latter part of this webinar, we will be doing question and answer. And if you have any questions, please put those in the Q&A box as opposed to the chat feature, which has been disabled for this webinar. So just put any questions you have in the Q&A and we will do our best to get to them. Again, thank you very much for joining us in our discussion about the Vietnam War. The Vietnam era, as you know, lasted from, the Vietnam War officially lasted from 1955 to 1975. Over 3.5 million lives lost by some estimates, including over 58,000 Americans. And it's important, I think, as we talk about the Vietnam War, regardless of how we feel about it, to honor those who gave their lives in service. The conflict between both changed both Vietnam and the United States in very different ways. On the battlefront, people were putting their lives on the line, whether through volunteering, being drafted, or in the case of people in Vietnam, by the war just being right at their front door. While the sacrifice was great, not everyone agreed about sending troops to fight in Vietnam. In 1965, 25% of the American public thought sending troops was a mistake. By 1967, that number had grown to 45%. And by 1971, 61% of Americans thought it was a mistake to keep fighting. Meanwhile, the draft was going on. Men, and only men, were required to sign up for the draft as soon as they turned 18. And if they hadn't done it then, at least between 18 and 25. And this was the cause of great discussion on college campuses around the country. Well, where male students could be studying in the library one day and shortly thereafter receive that letter from the Department of Defense beginning greetings. And if you were a student or of age in the 1960s, you got that letter and it would send a shiver down your spine, at least it did mine. Protests, meanwhile, took place all over the country. TCU was a relatively quiet place in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Some people did not protest, and some volunteered to sign up for the armed services, and others were very engaged in protest against the war. So thank you for joining us today for TCU Presents. The session today is brought to you by Adran College, the TCU Alumni Association, and TCU Magazine. In the future, we will hold another webinar with veterans of the war to learn about life on the battlefield. So today we're going to look back at what people in the US, but really especially at TCU, were seeing, hearing, and discussing during the Vietnam War, and then talk about how perspectives have changed in the last 50 years. Let me tell you about our panel. I would first like to introduce Ted Coonfield. Ted is joining us from his home in Oregon. He graduated twice from TCU with an undergraduate degree in 1970 and with an MFA in 1972. He's a retired business executive, management consultant. He was on the board of directors of Kitty Hawk Airlines. He consulted for the state of Oregon for 16 years and has worked with a diverse collection of businesses, governments, and nonprofits. Ted's memoir, The Varmints, Living with Appalachian Outlaws, is based on his experience living on a farm in Ohio while working on a doctorate at Ohio University. Two distinguished faculty members from the Department of History are also joining us today. Dr. Kara Dixon Buick is the Corporal Benjamin W. Schmidt Professor of War, Conflict, and Society in 20th Century America. That is officially the longest title of any faculty member at TCU. She's the author of The Girls Next Door, Bringing the Home Front to the Front Lines. Dr. Buick is also the author of Officer, Nurse, Woman, the Army Nurse Corps and the Vietnam War, and the editor of the Rutledge Handbook on Gender War in the U.S. Military. She earned her doctorate from Indiana University and was recently named one of the 2 inaugural National Archives Foundation Cokie Roberts Women's History Fellows. Dr. Peter Worthing is Associate Dean of Graduate Studies and Research in the Addran College of Liberal Arts, Professor of History and co-chair of the Department of English, a scholar of Chinese history. Dr. Worthing is the author of 3 books: General He Yingan, The Rise and Fall of Nationalist China, A Military History of Modern China from the Manchu Conquest to Tiananmen Square, Occupation and Revolution, China and the Vietnamese August Revolution of 1945. He is a graduate of Trinity College and the University of Hawaii. Someday we could have a webinar about what it's like to go to college in Hawaii. My name's Don Mills. I am a retired faculty member from the College of Education and previously served in administration at TCU for 40 years, including as Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs. So we could start anywhere in our discussion of Vietnam, but I thought it might be interesting just to very briefly talk about TCU in the 1970s. I was asked if the topic of war was on everybody's lips. Well, everybody's experience in college is a unique experience to them. And for some people, the Vietnam War was very much on their lips. But for many others, Vietnam was an abstraction. They were very interested in social life. Survey we did recently found that folks from the late 60s and early 70s talked a lot about social life, about lousy football teams, and about changes in women's roles. There was more interest probably in a document called Student Rights and Responsibilities. The administration was very conservative, and their expectation of student behavior was very traditional and conservative. Alcohol was not allowed on campus. That's different than saying alcohol was not on campus. We did have some big name entertainment on campus. The Grateful Dead played at TCU, the Jefferson Airplane played at TCU, but it was not a hotbed of activity. One person in their survey said it was the Tom Brown liberals versus the rest of the campus. So that probably gives a little bit of a description of what the campus was like. But Ted, you were a member of TCU's student body, and you thought the war was a mistake. Do you think our student body mirrored the 61% who opposed the war by 1971?
No, I think that comment about the Tom Brown liberals is probably accurate. No, I don't think it was anywhere near. I think most students were still kind of out of the 50s and 60s and into sororities and fraternities and sports and some classes and socializing. But there was a small group of people who really, where the war resonated with them as being the place where America should not be. And so we had a small committed group of people that did peaceful demonstrations. We read the names of the war dead on the front steps of the Brown Lumpton Student Center. I went before the faculty senate and asked every faculty member to talk about the war vis-a-vis their particular subject matter, and many faculty members did that. But in terms of consciousness and awareness of the war, as I don't think it was really pervasive at TCU at the time.
Yeah, I think that's probably accurate. Dr. Worthing, Vietnam was different from all previous wars of the United States because it was the first one that was being televised. What kind of things were people seeing on TV and hearing on the radio that drove public opinion in the US?
Yeah, that's true, Don. Sometimes people refer to the American War in Vietnam as the first television war. And I'm sure many people with us today remember certain images that were prominent at the time. In 1963, there was a famous photo of a Buddhist monk immolating himself. In 1968, there was a famous photo of the Saigon police chief executing an NLF suspect in the streets of Saigon during the Tet Offensive. There's a famous picture of a young girl from, I think, 1972, whose clothes had been burned off her body as a result of a napalm attack. So there were lots of images, I think, that people took away from that war. And in many respects, it was present every day. I can remember being a little kid sitting down at the breakfast table and my mother would have the radio on. And I can remember hearing battle at such and such place, so many killed, so many wounded. So whether it was video or images or the radio or even print media, people were getting a lot more information about what was happening, the actual action on the ground, than I think was the case with previous wars. And I think, that really had an influence on the way people began to question the war. One of the things we saw during the Vietnam War, the American War in Vietnam, was a kind of gradual change in the number of people who answered the question, did the US make a mistake by getting involved in Vietnam? The numbers of people who said, yes, it was a mistake, grew gradually throughout the experience. And some of that, I think, it can be traced to the images and the things people saw happening on the ground in Vietnam.
Yeah, I think that's right. I know my own experience, because I was in college in the 60s, was that the more we learned about it, the more we were questioning, what's this all about? And regardless of which side of that argument you came down on.
And it's kind of interesting, Don, because a lot of people, when you ask a question like that, a lot of people think of those images that I mentioned.
Yeah.
But there were other things. In 1966, I believe, there were hearings, the Fulbright hearings, that were broadcast on television. And Johnson administration officials had to sit there and answer questions, and many of their answers were less than satisfactory. So it wasn't just kind of graphic images or scenes of American soldiers burning villages or things like that. It was members of the Johnson administration basically expressing openly their doubts, their concerns, and sometimes answering questions by saying, well, we don't really know, that made many Americans feel uncomfortable about the American effort in Vietnam.
Great, thank you. So Dr. Buick, while the draft was top of mind for college-age men at that time, women were redefining their places in the world because second wave feminism was simultaneously sweeping through the United States. Can you give us insight into how women at that time were adapting to both of these forces?
Yeah, absolutely. This was an era, the late 60s, early 70s, when women's opportunities were expanding really rapidly. Some of those opportunities came more slowly to different parts of the country than they did others. But when I interviewed a lot of women who ultimately became Army nurses and served in the Vietnam War, they often described the era as sort of this limited period in which they could be either a teacher, a nurse, or a secretary. And those were their three career options. And strictly speaking, those weren't their only career options, but that was how many women felt that their lives were defined. And so a lot of women turned to the military as a way to sort of blend this traditionally women's role as a nurse with a route that would allow you to be financially independent, to travel, to see the world, as the military like to tell you, you could do. Women found a way to blend those opportunities, to not completely rock the boat, but also to do something that would give them some independence and some freedom. And even within the military, most people don't associate the US military with feminism. But in this period, you see a lot of women in uniform fighting for equal opportunity, fighting to remove restrictions on their rank, on the ways they could serve. A lot of women were fighting, for example, most women who got pregnant or became a parent were immediately discharged in this era, and women were fighting those kinds of restrictions. They were fighting so that their husbands could get the same benefits that male soldiers' wives got. So there were a lot of ways in which women were kind of blending the military experience and feminism. And what's really interesting to me anyway, is that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was on the forefront of fighting for these programs through the ACLU and other organizations. And so I think that legacy is still there. Certainly we see that today.
It's interesting when you talk about the rights that women were fighting for at TCU. As Ted can recall, women in the late 60s were fighting for the right to wear pants on campus. It was considered a great achievement when finally the conservative administration at TCU said, yes, women could wear jeans, but shorts were not allowed until into the 1970s. So as you said, parts of the country were advancing at different rates.
Yeah.
When I entered TCU, there was an 11 o'clock weekday curfew and a 1 o'clock weekend curfew. You couldn't wear pants or jeans or shorts to classes, or I don't know about out in public. I think if you're going out for entertainment or, off campus, you could. And it was that during the 4 years I was there that we saw a radical change at TCU in terms of how they viewed women. That doesn't mean that TCU got rid of in loco parentis, though. No. I mean, we fought, and Don was a comrade in helping the administration see that students actually are real people. And they come at 18 years old and they're might be slightly wet behind the ears, but by God, they're still feeling, thinking individuals that need respect from the administration. And we worked at it.
Yeah. So, Dr. Buick, the draft was only for men, and it's still in existence. Still is only for men, right? It's still in existence, but it's still being talked about in the halls of power in Washington, D.C. Just recently. What was the discussion about the draft? Women could volunteer for certain roles in the military, but they were not eligible for the draft. Was there any conversation about equality of sexes and that they should be drafted?
Not in the halls of Congress. Not at that time. That was never even a question. What I find really interesting is that women themselves were thinking about those issues. A lot of women that I got to interview said very explicitly that they thought it was unfair that their friends who were men could be drafted and that they couldn't. And so a lot of women I interviewed volunteered for military service because they felt that difference was unfair. A lot of women who were nurses felt that regardless of their politics of the war, regardless of what they thought of the war itself, that as nurses, as medical personnel, they should go, that they should volunteer. On the other hand, a lot of nurses, most nurses, in fact, who joined the Army, did so as a way to pay for their education. And not all of them were very keen on an assignment to Vietnam. Once they got their orders, a lot of them were very, very upset about that. But it was very common. There was a woman here who I've never met, but I've sort of discovered in looking at things at TCU, Jane Westfelling. believe her father was a commandant at West Point. She had two brothers who had served in Vietnam and had been injured. And she was a nursing student. And when she graduated, she joined the Army Nurse Corps because she wanted to provide the same kind of medical care that her brothers had received. She wanted to provide that for others who were injured. And that's a very typical kind of route to military service for these women. But a lot of them did think about it in terms of what women and men owe the state, and particularly during wartime, and thought about it as a matter of equality, even sort of unexplicitly. When they start to talk about it, they kind of wrap their discussion in that language. But nobody in Congress really thought about it at that time. It came about a few years later, but not at the height of the war.
You know, it's interesting because I know my own experience was women who were opposed to the war had very conflicted feelings about what they were telling men to do. Because it was, if a man decided to go to Canada as opposed to being drafted, they suffered, but women would not, even though that was what they thought was right. And on the other side, if a man volunteered, woman could volunteer, but normally not in combat situations. No. So it was a very tricky time in that relationship between men and the war and women in the war. But we forget sometimes, Dr. Worthing, that there's a whole nother group of women who didn't have a choice about the war, and that was the women in Vietnam. What do we know about the situation there?
Now, that's a very good point, Don. Women actually played a very prominent role in the war in Vietnam, but most of them were fighting on really for the National Liberation Front in particular, which the National Liberation Front is, of course, that organization that most Americans refer to as the Viet Cong.
Right.
They recognized the role that women could play. And it was interesting to hear Dr. Viewert talk about American women seeing an opportunity in the military, looking for additional opportunities. The very same could be said of women, rural women in particular, in South Vietnam. Their lives were very regimented, very restricted, and some of them were looking for opportunities to get involved, to play a larger role, to take on some responsibility. And the National Liberation Front understood this and approached these women and helped organize them and bring them into the war effort. One of the things the National Liberation Front did across South Vietnam was organize what they called women's liberation associations. And essentially what these did is they brought women together, and part of it was certainly to try to harness their energy, to bring them into the war effort. But they also offered them some opportunities. In other words, they gave them opportunities to have a voice in how the village was governed. These kinds of associations that the NLF created, whether it was the Women's Association or the Farmers Association, they essentially helped to govern their own villages. They helped settle disputes. They helped handle public works projects that needed to be done. They served as a quasi-government that they were not getting from the Republic of Vietnam, the South Vietnamese government. So lots of women in the countryside of South Vietnam ended up supporting the NLF because it offered them this opportunity to play a role. Some of them actually participated in combat, but I would argue that many more supported in a kind of logistical fashion. In other words, if one military unit was moving from an area with which it was familiar to an area with which it was not so familiar, a woman from the local area might serve as a guide to help them move through the territory on the way to their objective. Or they might provide logistical support for troops at various points. So there were lots of women in South Vietnam who joined the NLF, in part at least, because they offered them an opportunity to participate, to have a voice, and to do something.
Don, if I might add, at TCU, some colleagues and I set up a draft counseling service in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And I found, for Dr. Viewek's sake, an article I had written in 1978 in a magazine that used to be published called Perspective. I seek other alternatives to inadequacies of the selective service system. Could not a draft law provide both men and women, ministers and seminarians with an opportunity to serve their country in various social concerns such as VISTA, the Peace Corps, Teacher Corps, Head Start, and other community agencies? So at 20 years old, I thought women ought to have the chance to serve.
Ted, you've always been ahead of your time. We've had some comments, and I do want to remind everyone that the draft was imposed on all men had to register, but by 1969, most men had college deferments. For a while, you could be deferred if you were married. The statistics show that there were a number of people who got married as a way to avoid military service. And by 1969, there was the draft lottery. Ted, I think you were in the draft lottery. I was not as fortunate. I received my draft notice before 1969. If I had been in the lottery, however, my number was 24, so that wouldn't have helped me. Good. In any case. But it was a very tricky time. Everybody was trying to figure out, is the draft fair? And it was not uncommon to hear the question, is the draft American? It's an issue, and it still remains with us today, somewhat abstractly, but still very real.
We actually just had a discussion in one of my classes yesterday about a student had done a presentation on the draft. And it's interesting because the anti-draft opposition united the far left and the far right.
Right.
But they were brought together in opposition to the same issue, which is something you very rarely see in American politics.
Right. Ted, you in addition to being one of the founders of a draft counseling center, you were co-founder of the Vietnam Moratorium Committee at TCU. What did you guys do besides holding signs?
Well, I don't remember the signs too much. I was co-chair with Keith Miller, now Dr. Keith Miller, professor of English at Arizona State University, who was just out in Portland visiting me, and we went to the coast of Oregon and spent some time together. Keith may or may not be on the call, I don't know. But as I said before, we went before the faculty senate and asked the faculty to focus on their particular academic area and the Vietnam War and what it meant. I remember having long conversations with my major professor, Dr. Gustave Ferre, who was head of the philosophy department. And I just want to take credit for bringing him around to becoming anti-war over time. We also read the War Dead. We did some other seminars, but this was a peaceful demonstration at TCU. I thought it was reflective. I thought it allowed people to speak their voice and be anti-war without going to the extremes of the weatherman or even the SDS who blew up ROTC buildings at the University of Wisconsin or other things like that. And I think individually, what impact do we have? As a collective around one university, what impact do we have? But as a nation, as student bodies all over the country protested this war, it had a dramatic impact on what happened politically and how the end of the war played out.
Yeah, at that moratorium, on National Moratorium Day, speaker at TCU was Senator Albert Gore, who was the father of former Vice President and presidential candidate Al Gore, who spoke with an anti-war message in Ed Landreth Hall. It was open to not just the TCU community, but to the Fort Worth community. I would say he was generally well received because anti-war people sort of self-selected in, knew what his message would be. But his message was more about geopolitics than it was the morality of the war, which is a pretty common approach from those in positions of authority. We also, Ted, you may remember the demonstration we had on campus after the students were killed at Kent State.
That was
and
May
that
of
was-
1970.
Correct. That demonstration was small, but we had a band. Again, I think it was typical of TCU. It was not, didn't get out of hand. A point was made, and was very respectful. The sponsor of much of that was the Canterbury Club, which was the Episcopal student organization. And Father Galen Poole worked with Reverend Roy Martin, who was the campus minister, on a number of anti-war issues on campus. I didn't know if you want to comment on that or not, Ted.
Well, I think the Kent State was a moment of both just raw sadness and anger. It wasn't a protest necessarily, as it more was a commemoration of lost lives, and and also a statement to the powers that be that we shouldn't send the National Guard into college campuses to shoot students. I mean, that's just not who we should be as a country. That era was very divisive. We talk about the current politics in America as being very divisive, but there were a lot of people who were for the war and a lot of people who were against the war, and there was love it or leave it, and there was protest and counter protest, and there was left wing and right wing shenanigans, it's I have a long FBI record from those days, because there was a lot of government sentiment that what we were doing was not in their best interest. And so it was an interesting time.
It was an interesting time indeed. And it was an interesting time on campus that I don't think everybody realized exactly what was happening and what the social implications of what was going on. Dr. Worthing, were the power players in Washington aware of the complexity of the social movements? And were they thinking about young people and those who were called to carry out the war effort as part of their internal discussions?
That's one of the great questions that people have debated. What was the impact of the anti-war movement? There are those who think the anti-war movement had a profound influence on the DC power brokers and helped bring the war to an end, the American phase of the war to an end. There are those who argue that, it really wasn't the anti-war demonstrations or the social movements that you mentioned, Don, that really had an influence on this. And it's hard to say one way or the other definitively. It's somewhere in between. You have to think that if one is the President of the United States, or one is a Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, any one of a number of decision makers in Washington, and one sees this kind of unrest in the country, you have to believe it's going to have an influence. And I happen to know that a number of the children of these power brokers got involved in these movements. So, for some of them, it hit pretty close to home. And, Robert McNamara, as early as 1965, saw a young man set himself on fire outside of his office in protest against the war. So you have to believe it had some kind of an influence.
Right.
On the other hand, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, they both had these movements investigated thoroughly. They were convinced that it was communists who were leading these anti-war demonstrations, who were drumming up all these protests, and they were consistently disappointed and frustrated when their investigators came back and said, "We see no evidence of that." So they saw it as something inappropriate, something foreign initiated, and therefore they did not want to make that a factor in their decision making. So it really is hard to tell exactly what influence it had on them. And it remains kind of a controversial question.
Yeah, I agree. Ted?
No, and I think, I think Dr. Worthing is right on a number of accounts, but I think there's a tremendous amount of evidence, even from what President Johnson spoke of himself, even at TCU in the commencement in 1968, when President Johnson came to announce that 18-year-olds should get the vote, because if we can send them to war at 18, then they should have a voice in our democracy. Now, it took 3 more years. It didn't pass in Congress until 1971. But, we were talking yesterday and setting up this webinar, and I remembered that President Johnson spoke on campus in May of 1968. And I went back and read his speech, and he was very aware of what was going on. And he, that year, decided to speak on a number of college campuses. TCU was more conservative, and he thought he would get a listening ear. He also knew people at TCU. He was Texan, and he came and he spoke about the change. We meet here tonight at a time when American University is at the center of the rapid change and the center of heated controversy. And he goes on for 3 or 4 paragraphs talking about the change and the foment that's happening on college campuses. I thought he was going to break in to Bob Dylan's "Times They Are Changing," but and he goes on to talk about a more conservative view of the protest movement. But he also knew, and very, very well aware, that that this was a significant controversial issue in American politics and American society, as his own words indicate, I think.
As one of our listeners or viewers, I'm not sure in a webinar if you're a listener or a viewer, but in any case, reminded us in the spring of 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated. Shortly after that, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. In 1970, the Kent State students were killed. Students at Jackson State were killed. Students at South Carolina State were killed. There were a number of movements going on in the country at the time. The civil rights movement had been going on the entire decade, and the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1965 lessened the activity somewhat, but that was increasing again by the end of the decade. The women's movement, as we've discussed, was also very active. So we had all these different forces going on, and this is sort of an open question to the panel. How did these other forces, societal forces, complicate how we thought about Vietnam? Well, there we go.
I think Dr. Buick ought to do it.
So, my immediate response is that a lot of these movements get united by the early 70s in particular. Some of the Black Power movement, the anti-colonial movements all kind of unite around this issue and start to see the American war in Vietnam as an extension of American empire, and see the war itself as, Dr. Worthing can talk more about this too, but part of a global sort of throwing off of the remnants of colonialism. And so it becomes, I think, for a lot of these groups, not just an American problem, but a broader problem in world history of the nature of empire, colonialism, sort of the legacies of that, in addition to race and sort of issues of race, and that and how all of that gets woven together. You can weave in the draft and the class and racial inequities of the draft with that. women's issues, all of it, I think gets really interwoven later in the war.
I think during the 60s, we see that confluence. I mean, Martin Luther King had a number of anti-war speeches
Right.
before he was shot.
Yeah.
I think we see early in 1967, when I was a freshman, we picketed against the war. Picketing came from the language of the civil rights movement. The draft, the population of America in the mid 60s was 11% Black, and we drafted over 50% of the troops that went to Vietnam were Black. I don't know the exact number, but I know it was over 50%. So as Dr. Buick says, the draft was racist. It was inequitable. It drafted more people in poverty, more Hispanics and more Blacks than it did white privileged people. Fact. Anyway, Dr. Worthing, you want to weigh in on this?
I agree with both of you. I think there were lots of movements or issues that became intertwined, and it became very complicated. In some cases, it brought people together. In other cases, it divided them. I just think one of the major dividing lines in the anti-war movement was the group who thought, well, this is a foreign policy mistake. The United States has just chosen poorly to get involved in this location at this time, and we need to do something about that. And the other group who said, no, this is really a natural outgrowth of American imperialism, and we need to overthrow the capitalist system, and that the United States is, institutionally broken, and we need to overthrow it, that kind of thing. So you had these points of commonality or convergence, but you also had these points of divergence, which made it so complicated and so complex.
There's some remnants of those voices still today. We have a question. How did the rest of the world view the United States, and how did it change as a result of what was happening in Vietnam and as they saw what was happening in our country? I guess that's another one for you.
Not good. Yeah, I mean, the longer this goes on, the longer the war went on, I think public image of the United States worldwide declined. And part of that is related to what Dr. Worthing said earlier about the images that were coming out from the war. And part of it is about what we just discussed with the confluence of the American war in Vietnam with other international issues. But it certainly didn't help the U.S. image abroad, to put it mildly.
I think many people, both in the United States and outside of the United States, were asking themselves some fundamental questions. For example, is this war a moral action? Is this a just war? Is this a legal war? And many people came to the conclusion that it was not. And this is one of the reasons the war was so controversial in the United States, is because many people felt that the most powerful military state on the face of the earth dropping bombs on a rather poor agricultural state was simply immoral. And there were many people around the world, many leaders around the world, who saw that the same way. And so I think many people outside of the United States questioned what the United States was doing in Vietnam as to whether or not it was moral. And many of them concluded it was not.
Yeah, I don't want to lose the thread of the protests of the Vietnam War and how it was inextricably woven in with the civil rights movement. But that also, and I've had wonderful discussions with some of my colleagues, women colleagues at TCU, who were becoming feminist and understanding that second wave movement. I was still a little naive. I didn't become a radical feminist till much later. But it also moved into from the civil rights movement and the war protest movement and the women's liberation movement into the war on poverty. And Johnson's war on poverty, he enumerates in his speech at TCU all the things that he had accomplished during his administration, and they were pretty amazing. If we had stayed on that track, we would have next to no poverty in America now. And through different administrations, we've changed that tactic. But in my life, those are those are the streams, threads that to this day, I still work in anti-poverty programs here in Portland.
Right. There's so many different ways that we can go, but we have a question from a person who I know was in school at the same time with Ted. And his question is, what role should the US play today in reducing and eliminating war? Did we learn anything from Vietnam, or for that matter, Afghanistan?
Well, for that matter, Iraq. I mean,
Yeah.
no, I tell people slightly cavalierly that within my lifetime, there's never been a justified war that America's been in. Now, that's might be extreme. Dr. Worthing maybe could help me understand the narrow-mindedness of my ways. But my father was a World War II veteran and marched in the Battle of the Bulge. I've never been anti-soldier. I've been anti-war and not anti-all wars. So, but I think in my lifetime, we did not learn from the Vietnam War about what it meant for American troops to intervene on foreign soil. Now, that's arguable, but that would be my position.
Yeah, I would, sorry, go ahead, Dr. Worthing.
No, you go, Carol, please.
Oh, no, I was going to say that I think the answer to the question from the military's perspective goes back to what Dr. Mills said at the very beginning, that your experience in college is your own. And in many ways, what the United States or what the military learned from the war also depends on where they sit on the political spectrum, right? And so coming out of the war in Vietnam, much of the right starts to perpetuate a myth, and I would definitely say it's a myth, that the war in Vietnam was a limited war, sort of that we had to fight with one hand behind our back idea, which by any measurable standard is an absolute myth, right? The US dropped more bombs, more tonnage of bombs on our ally South Vietnam than we did in all of World War II in both theaters combined. Right? It's not a limited war. On the other hand, there are many coming out of the war from the left that say the US should have a complete non-interventionist policy in terms of foreign policy. So it's everything, right, on the spectrum. The military comes away, a lot of military leaders coming out of the Vietnam War are kind of trying to understand how the most powerful military in the history of the universe has been defeated by an agriculturalist society and a peasant army. And those are hard lessons to reckon with. And I think the Gulf War in '91 shows in part how we try to reckon with that in terms of, full-on assaults, quick victory, quick wars. Iraq and Afghanistan suggests we didn't, that we still have some of those same issues. I would say too that one of the most important legacies of the Vietnam War is the all-volunteer force that we have today. The draft ends, and that today we have a professional force, which by definition changed the nature of who serves and why, and how the military sort of trains and recruits and all of that. So that's a definite legacy. The sort of the political lessons that there are probably as many lessons as there are individuals.
That's actually what I was going to say too, Kara, that people I think have learned lessons from Vietnam. The trouble is they're different lessons. But I was reminded when you were speaking that, some similar questions are being asked or have been asked in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. People in Vietnam sometimes ask themselves, what did this war mean? What was it all about? What did we get for it? Was it worth the sacrifice? So people on all sides of this war, I think, are asking similar questions.
One of our listeners asked us to talk about the Domino Theory. One of the justifications for the war in Vietnam was to stop the spread of communism. And certainly after World War II, the US defense budget, well, actually the entire US budget was organized around, the organizing principle was to stop, how do we stop the spread of communism? And so a big portion of that budget went to defense. Big portion of our budget still goes to defense. But we still hear people say, well, we have to control the influence of other countries, whether we call them communists or not. And our budget shows that it's still militarily that we think about that. I don't know, Dr. Buick or Dr. Worthing, if you want to talk about the domino theory and what it means.
What occurs to me when you ask a question like that, Don, is, what was the fundamental nature of this war? The domino theory, of course, implies that from the US perspective, in a world in which the communist states are trying to expand to other states, if one goes communist, then it will hit the dominoes and leave others going. So we'll have this chain reaction. And that would be antithetical to US national security. So Americans went into the American war in Vietnam thinking that's what this war is about. This is a part of global containment to stop the spread of communism. But if you ask the people who were fighting the war on the other side, if you ask the rank and file, some of the leadership were hardcore communists, no doubt, but I don't even know that they had this notion of a world revolution so much as they wanted to liberate their own country. But for the rank and file who fought the war on behalf of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, North Vietnam, or the NLF, which was the Viet Cong, they were trying to liberate their country from the vestiges of colonial rule. Their understanding of what the conflict was all about was deeply rooted in the French colonial period. And so there was a kind of fundamental disconnect between the two groups involved in this war. The Americans were fighting this Cold War struggle, and many Vietnamese were fighting this war of national liberation. And so that kind of fundamental disconnect, I think, is one of the saddest parts of the war, and really kind of helps, I think, explain why things turned out as they did.
Yeah. We have lots of questions, and one question has to do with how did the US respond to, after the war ended, respond to the Vietnamese refugees coming to the country as immigrants? And were there any at TCU, and how were they received at TCU? I'll respond to the TCU. There were some at TCU, and of course there's a very large Vietnamese community in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and we have quite a few students, I don't know the exact number, but quite a few students who can trace their history, their personal history back to Vietnam. Some who go home regularly to Vietnam to visit family. And I think they are well respected and well received at TCU. I don't think that was always true at the beginning. There were certainly some folks who saw everybody who was Vietnamese as the enemy. I also remember an international student whose family was from South Vietnam, who was unhappy because at an event where international flags were flown representing every international student at TCU, the flag for Vietnam that was flown was the flag of the unified Vietnam after the war, and she said, "That's not my country." So I think there were a number of challenges, both for Americans receiving immigrants and for immigrants trying to figure out how all this is going to work in as they settle into American society. But generally, I think it went pretty well and continues to be better. I'm perfectly willing for any other panelists to take a shot at that question. And they're shaking their heads saying, nope. So an interesting observation from one of our listeners is that the North, and I'm just going to quote, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were precursors of the Taliban's comment to the US earlier this year. You have the watch, but we have the time. Is in terms of a strategy of the North Vietnamese, does that make sense?
It does to a certain extent, Don. And the reason I hesitate at all is because in the last 10 or 12 years, we've learned a lot more about DRV, North Vietnamese, and NLF strategy. And while certainly there was there was a lot of talk about protracted war, dragging the war out, eventually exhausting the United States, bleeding it dry, so to speak, engaging in a kind of low intensity combat that would ultimately lead the United States to decide that it wasn't worth it and to withdraw. But the more we learn, the more we realize that the person who was really driving strategy in the North was a man named Le Duan. And he had supplanted Ho Chi Minh and Von Nguyen Giap and other traditional leaders as the kind of spearhead of North Vietnamese strategy. And he was determined, from what we can understand, he was determined to strike hard, to engage the United States toe-to-toe in kind of more conventional, large-scale activities, military operations, in order to drive the Americans out. So for example, the Tet Offensive of 1968, major offensive by the DRV, the 1972 Nguyen Hue or Easter Offensive, same thing. These were both his brainchildren, so to speak. So while there were those in the DRV leadership who often talked about low intensity conflict, protracted war, dragging it out, there was also this group within the DRV leadership that wanted to fight, wanted to make it happen, and wanted to end things sooner. And so it's a more complicated picture than we heretofore have understood.
Good, that's very helpful, thank you. So we are running right up against our hour. I'm going to take a moment of personal privilege. Since of the panelists, I have the longest consecutive experience actually on the TCU campus, to say that I think there are events from the outside that change the face of a campus. And it doesn't always change it immediately. But I think there was a confluence of events in the late 60s and early 70s that changed TCU. TCU moved from being a pretty good regional college to begin to recruit nationally. While the administration was very conservative and looked at student life as how do we control students, academically, beginning to go look for scholars, to begin to think about how do we make TCU a more respected academic institution. But recruiting students from around the country also meant bringing in students who had different ideas about what student life should be about. And student life began to move from in loco parentis, although there are students today who will still say it's here, but from control to helping students develop skills and talents and abilities that they will need as they graduate, so that they have both the intellectual firepower and the so-called soft skills. So I think the Vietnam War really changed how TCU students saw themselves, how faculty saw themselves, and what our mission was. I think we've probably just come through another one of those periods, or are coming through. I don't think we have any idea how the pandemic is going to change higher education or how it's going to change TCU. And there are moments in between Vietnam and the pandemic, obviously, that have had an impact on TCU. In 1979, which is 10 years past, roughly, we're talking, TCU had an endowment of under $50 million. Now, $50 million is a lot for a person. It's not much for an institution. TCU now has an endowment of about $2 billion. So part of the challenge for TCU as it has become richer is how does it have more influence for our students, positive influence for our students and in the higher education community. And I think TCU is struggling with how to use that, the authority and power that comes from being a more wealthy institution as opposed to the scrappier one that it was 50 years ago. So that was my, I'm just taking advantage of the fact that I had the microphone. I appreciate all of you who have joined us. I know some of you have to drop off. I'm willing to stay on. I think Ted's willing to stay on for a while. So if you want to stay on, we'll be willing to stay on for about 10 or 12 more minutes. I guess this is a question for both Dr. Buick and Dr. Worthing. The soldiers who came back from Vietnam, many of whom suffered both traumatic physical injuries and PTSD. How did that change the way we treat soldiers in terms of their injuries, both on the battlefield and when they come home?
It's the Vietnam War veterans who make PTSD, who fight to make PTSD a recognized mental illness in the DSM, right? It's their activism that pushed for that. Military has a pretty spotty record with dealing with mental health issues. I think some would argue through the present, though it's certainly gotten a lot better. But I think the Vietnam War generation really brought to light some of the ways that that war affects people, and the sort of the politically contentious nature of this war in particular raised those questions in a more obvious way, right? That's not to say that even something like World War II, where most people saw that war as justified, that's not to say that that's coming out of that war didn't have the same kinds of mental health issues that future and previous generations did as well. But the nature of the Vietnam War in particular made those issues more pronounced and public. And those veterans fought for it and then later fought the VA for an expansion of what was considered PTSD and sort of all of those things. So I think current serving personnel have a lot to thank the Vietnam War generation for in terms of mental health, even though there's still a long way to go.
There was a long history of language around the consequences of participation in war. I mean, there was battle fatigue, there was shell shock. I read one time, I saw about 10 of those, language usage to describe basically what we now call PTSD. So I think, the response to veterans and PTSD is not much different than our response to mental illness and the bigger picture of things around, how, I worked in the state of Oregon for a number of years, and how we choose to fund and respond to people with mental illness has been replete with neglect, with misadventures, etc. And I think as a society, those, the least among us, how we treat them speaks to who we are. So I think taking care of our soldiers, taking care of other people with mental illnesses is, bespeaks to who we are as a nation. And I think we can get better.
Okay. It was, I think the medical care, just for battlefield injuries, has so dramatically improved. I would like to ask the panel a question about returning soldiers. Nowadays, you can't go anywhere where there is military without people thanking military for their service, which I think is great. I'm all for it. But soldiers returning from Vietnam, it was a very different response. In fact, many soldiers did not want to wear their uniforms because of the way they were treated in public. Anybody want to comment on why that difference and what have we learned and et cetera?
I think a lot of that, Don, is tied up in that question we were talking about a while back about, was the war a moral action? Was it justified? And some people had real concerns about participating in that kind of a war. And unfortunately, I think some people expressed themselves rather freely to people who did participate in it. So, you know, this war, the American war in Vietnam, because of its nature and the questions surrounding it, made it all the more difficult for people to decide whether or not to be a part of it, and made it all the more difficult for those who did participate for whatever reason when they returned home.
Yeah, I think the lack of a clear victory, right, also changes things. There are no victory parades after Vietnam.
Right.
For a while, the government had organized sort of returning, like celebrations for returning vets. And when they landed in Washington, they realized that they're celebrating the folks who return, and literally at the same time, they're marching the next crop on to the plains. And so, you know, there were, for a long time, folks said, well, there was no like welcome home celebration. There was none of this. And that was a deliberate choice by the US government, because they realized we can't celebrate if we're not ending this. And when it does end, it's not in victory. And so
Right.
I think that that matters quite a lot as well. Yeah, I think part of the culture that you mentioned today is in many ways, you know, the sort of thank you for your service culture is a response to, you know, the perception that Americans didn't welcome home veterans after Vietnam. It's almost compensation for that in many ways, I think.
I recall a friend coming home from Vietnam who was drafted and served 2 years. He became kind of assistant debate coach at TCU, and we were walking from Landreth Hall over towards the Student Center along University Avenue, where there were trees, and a car on University Avenue backfired, and he immediately took cover under a tree as a reaction from being 2 years in a war zone. As I picked him up and I said, "Are you okay?" I decided that I was never going to be anti-soldier. I mean, because these people were in very traumatic situations. Some of them were drafted and they didn't have a choice, but even those who chose, the war took its human toll.
Yeah, and that may be a good way for us to end this webinar. I think we could go on. I think there's a message here to the Alumni Association that they would, these are topics that people are very interested in. One of the comments that someone made is, what is the firepower that we're providing for students nowadays? I think that would be a great future program to talk about how our academic program has evolved and the partnerships, both on campus and between campus and community. So there's a lot going on. I want to personally thank Dr. Worthing, Dr. Buick, my longtime, not old, friend, Ted Kuhnfield, and to each of you who took time out of your day to join us for this webinar. We are honored that you chose to spend time with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Nice to reconnect. And Dr. Worthing and Dr. Buick, it was really an honor to be on a panel with you.
You.
Thank you very much, Ted. Nice meeting you. Thank you, Don.